Hi, welcome to Making Waves on Purpose. Today I'm joined by Lane Jost, the head of ESG for Edelman Smithfield. We are going to discuss Scope 1, 2, and 3, climate risk, the GHG protocol, Scope 4 and greenwashing, and a wide variety of other topics in the ESG space. Lane and I work together at Sodexo and PwC. We've known each other and been friends for years. And as is the case in what I hope to achieve in all of my conversations, it was a freewheeling and authentic conversation where we both shared our thoughts and came to some interesting conclusions. And now I bring you Lane Jost. So, Lane Jost, thanks for joining us today. Let's talk about Scope 1, 2, and 3, and now 4. Give us your thoughts on the evolving definitions and boundaries of carbon emission reporting.
Well, I think my perspective, probably much like yours, Jeff, as somebody who's kind of been in the back office counting kilowatt hours for almost 15 years, is this is overall very positive. There's sort of this overall momentum from a kind of a business and a regulatory kind of lens, that this idea that carbon emissions are, on the business side, material to business success. And I guess on the societal side, we need, and I agree with the science, we need to get as close to a 1.5 degree world as we can. So I think the overall is, like, for me, like, overwhelmingly positive. But then I guess the details are what really matter. I really focus on US companies. So US public companies, US private companies who are still like 1.0 in integrating climate risk and ESG reporting into their operations. So I really encourage them to focus on Scope 1 and 2, because even if we think about the greenhouse gas protocol, Scope 1 and 2 are where they can actually have influence and create change. So that's what I would say there. I'd say on 3, which of course is all in the media, and of course the SEC is signaling an approach to Scope 3. You know, the UK, of course, before, and then of course just the past couple of weeks, the ISSB is basically going to mandate Scope 3. I think the picture gets a little muddier, and I just think it all depends on what kind of industry you operate in, what kind of trajectory you have. The other thing I'd say about Scope 3, just generally, if you think about the greenhouse gas protocol, which is really what we're talking about from an accounting framework, it's actually pretty prescriptive. Somebody said this to me recently at a conference, where even if you look at, the history of GAAP accounting, for instance, there's a ton of estimations in financial statements. And so this idea, there's this sort of chorus of people that say, oh, well, Scope 3 is so expensive and so burdensome for companies. By the way, I'm very sympathetic to that. But again, depending on the industry. But for some companies, there's actually tools that are publicly available. There's assumptions that are publicly available, the greenhouse gas protocol, that if you just do a Scope 3 accounting and estimation, and 1.0, you do your disclosure, it's actually not as hard as people think. And you're at least moving in the right direction. On the investor side, you're showing investors what your risk is to your business, which for a lot of companies, particularly in the US, will be hardly anything. And then on the more complicated side, at least you're kind of on the path to figure out how you can govern Scope 3 risk, like, for instance, the TCFD as a framework. So I guess that's my kind of thought on Scope 3. And then Scope 4, I think you mentioned, I don't even know where to start with Scope 4. I understand Scope 4. I think we just got to focus on 1 and 2 and then do an estimation on 3, and then we can talk about 4. That's my thought.
I think that's fair. I think on 4 is really interesting, because I do see the rationale behind saying, hey, we're bringing these disruptive products and services to market that bring down emissions, and we should be able to capture those in some way. And if not, air quotes, take credit for them, acknowledge that technology and new products and services is part of the solution, and that some companies that do that will in fact grow their emissions, but in general will diminish the emissions overall as they displace other less productive means of providing those goods and services. However, I think it is so ripe for being abused by greenwashers that it's really tricky.
I think the thing to remember about, like, the greenhouse gas protocol, and again, let's just say scopes 1 through 4, is that they're just estimation templates for management. It's all about how management actually executes the capture of the data. And so that's like the first job to do. We get asked a lot of times, like, well, how do we solve Scope 3? Well, no one has really solved Scope 3. can we just be clear? This whole idea, I mean, there's a sort of a rising chorus, I think, out there in kind of the hardcore ESG sustainability world, which basically says if you sort of solve scope 3, you're going to fix climate change, you'll solve all the world's problems. Like, that's just not true. Like this whole notion of like measure it, you can manage it if you measure it, I think is one of the biggest fallacies in business. Like, I think it should be changed. Like, if you measure it, you might be able to manage it. So it's like, you know what I mean? Like, it's intent really matters, and feasibility and effort are kind of variables that aren't put into the model. But back to your point about scope 4, we're working with this like major private R&D organization. So it's not a public company. It's actually not even a company, but they're, basically they want to get their ESG reporting together. And like, they're basically like, hey, because of our sophistication as a science organization, particularly in climate, we would like to contribute to the global agenda around like developing scalable technology in like modular nuclear, for instance. But how can we get credit for that in the greenhouse gas protocol, to your point about scope 4? So that's like a good question, because it's easy to forget that there's only one KPI that matters, which is like gross emissions going down. Like that's the only thing that matters. I mean, I'm simplifying, but that's really right? What else matters?
Yeah. Especially at a planetary scale. Not at necessarily a business scale, because, one business may come in and grow and displace 4 others or something like that. I agree with you on that, and thank you for pushing back on management orthodoxy of, if you measure, if you may.
It's an unpopular take that will get me no invites to other podcasts. But I kind of feel like, I'm just tired of hearing that line, it's maybe you can manage it. Like, it's hard.
That's right. It's necessary, but not sufficient.
That's it's sort of a more poetic way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah. No. And I mean, Einstein said this, not everything measured matters, and not everything that matters can be measured.
Well, this other smart guy that I met a couple weeks ago said, we were talking about, of course, the attack on sort of the ESG, and of course, everyone's favorite debate right now, which is the culture wars colliding with ESG. The U.S. state legislators going after ESG. And then, of course, one of the sort of the linchpins of the argument is that, oh my gosh, Wall Street, MSCI and others are trying to make money on bad ESG data. Okay, that's shocking. But I think the thing is, he said this thing about data is important, but information is more important, which I thought was just a really compelling, you know what I mean? But to get information, you probably need to work through iterations of better data. So you should probably just keep churning.
That's funny, because most people would say those are synonyms, wouldn't they? Data and information.
And that's exactly what I was thinking. I was like, because data is sort of this, I feel like this has been this sort of buzzword for a decade, data. Data is inherently good. Well, actually, information is what we're looking for, insight, right?
Yeah. But all of this is supposed to lead to better outcomes for society and business, which brings us to this whole wrestling match we're now having around single and double materiality, which I must say I'm a little confused by why we need this. But give me your take on what you're hearing and what you're thinking about in regards to this.
Again, my take is with a very sort of US kind of a lens, and a very much kind of, my other sort of take is a little bit less on the societal priorities, so climate, DI, and poverty, but a little bit more on just American companies are really, in my view, only kind of recently waking up to ESG, sustainability, and the associated acronyms as business opportunities. I just think, can we just get to ESG materiality? I mean, as we know, ESG materiality is its own definition, really separate from, of course, financial and legal materiality. It really coming from the Global Reporting Initiative, which really just says a way that internal and external stakeholders have evaluated your top, social and environmental topics. So I just think we need to focus on that, because I think one of the problems with ESG, and there's a lot of problems that these acronyms suggest, is this idea that companies have to be all things to all people with ESG topics. Not true. We need to focus on what are the most important and risk and opportunities to them, and then in terms of the sort of the change side, the societal outcome side, where can they actually have the most input into that conversation and also build a business around it. And then here comes double materiality. I just think double materiality as it's written feels very sort of academic and theoretical, and just makes the conversation harder. And again, I guess the conversation to me is how do you convince decision makers at big companies to adjust their business model to be more responsive to the needs of the world, which I know is a simplistic way to put it. You start getting into single versus double materiality, I think this thing could be game over. So it's kind of an aggressive take. And I guess the last point would be there's a lot of voices out there, again, they're a little bit more Eurocentric, that say the whole thing, if you don't get double materiality, ESG itself is just basically a sham and saving capitalism from itself. So there's some polarizing views here. I guess I'm, again, a little bit more in the middle, that if you get to single materiality, you have a chance to get to double materiality, but that's a longer game. You got to build it slowly.
Well, I think your point on longer game is exactly right. I think the genesis of this problem is that so many people, when the concept of ESG got traction and became a market revolution, everybody changed the name of their corporate responsibility effort to ESG. And so now because everybody wanted to ride that wave. And I get it. Great. Fine. The problem is that the ESG concept was created in a very narrow, defined way. And that, these issues, corporate responsibility, sustainability, D&I, the programs that were being developed, the strategies and programs that are developed and deployed were driving business value that markets could start to measure alpha on, stock price or market cap or what have you, that was going to affect some metric that investors were going to care about, and that ESG was going to capture that. Great. So they're by definition looking at how these things add business value rather than through a societal value. Now, over a longer period of time, there's no doubt that there is a convergence between societal value and business value. We know that businesses can't thrive in the long term where society or communities are failing. In the short term, they can, and we know that. But in the long term, the problem is that the ESG is embedded in a system that is inherently short term right now. So we need, as part of this ESG revolution, a long-termism revolution as well, which is maybe even harder to get traction on.
I think what you said, basically, it makes all kinds of sense. I think maybe, and actually you said it better than I did. How would I put this? I'm personally sympathetic to the sort of single double materiality continuum.
Right.
And just to simplify it, right? Like single materiality is sort of inside out. Like if company X manages their climate risk, let's just say they use the TCFD framework. Let's say they measure scope 3. Let's say they measure scope 4. And they sort of figured it out. They sort of talked to experts. They said, this is how our business will be, if our business is operated in, Florida, this is how we're going to invest, change our capital allocation to move some data centers around, keep doing our business if we get hazards and storms. All right. So if you think about the sort of double materiality, where they're going to say, okay, but how does that actually support this sort of goal to get to 1.5? It doesn't. I mean, that's fair, right? That has nothing to do with 1.5 degrees. My point is a little bit more about like sort of change management cycles. And then to your comment, like, is the human change management going to be fast enough to solve climate change? Probably not. And, solve climate change. So, I think that's a fair criticism. I just think if you go into the boardroom right now and you start talking about double materiality, and that every business decision needs to be made with expertise, to solve things like climate, D&I, poverty, early child education. The list goes on. We've got a lot of problems. I just think you get nowhere because companies have to focus on what they're good at. I think a lot of smarter people than me have written books about that. So I guess that's my problem with double materiality is I think some companies are ready for it. I think most aren't.
Yeah, I think you said it just right. And it's a challenge, isn't it, in that as we see instinctually and in our hearts that something has to change and change fairly radically to meet this 1.5 degree target and ensure the our livelihoods and our children's and the success of our society, both locally and globally. But at the same time, knowing that change management doesn't happen by screaming, that the walls are falling. So it's really difficult to figure out that balance and feel like you're doing enough and in the right way. I'm sympathetic to both sides of this and how to find that kind of middle path, which is always the challenge. Last thoughts, what excites you? What are you having fun with these days?
That's such a great question. I think for me, very honestly, is, again, for someone who's sort of been doing this at varying degrees of success for a little while, it's exciting. I mean, there's sort of the ESG, as you say, sort of everyone hitching their sort of wagon to ESG for a moment. So let's just talk about why that's exciting. So it's exciting because you're meeting with decision-making people who are typically not just ESG and sustainability people. They're general counsels, they're CFOs, they're CEOs who are like, okay, I understand this. I understand 1.5. I understand that DE&I is an important part of the value creation process. I understand that on a little bit more on the operational side, supply chain resilience and supply chain risk, whether it's climate, whether it's human, is actually something that we need to build capacity in. So this sort of sympathy to the business case for ESG in my day-to-day is never more palpable, is never more common. That's what's exciting. And I think specifically to organizations who were maybe about to become public or just became public, this idea of getting it right the first time versus really let's just be clear, those of us that have been doing this for a little while, like it was reporting. And then it was, how do you back into a strategy around really thinking about ESG or sustainability across your organization culturally? What excites me now is these newer companies are trying to think about it from day one. We've all been to these conferences, these corporate citizenship, these CSR conferences where you get, somebody gets up there and says, my company and, in the history of dairy, sustainability was always a thing. It's just not a thing. I don't think. Apologies for those people that say that. So, but these organizations are a lot more humble. They're like, we don't know what to do. And by the way, and here's the more cynical side, because I'm sure people are listening to this are going to be like, okay, well, that's not enough. I think that's different. The idea like a general counsel or the IR, the investor relations people will be like, okay, so I'm reading these 500-page SEC document. This scares the crap out of me. Like, that's good. Like, that they're scared of that thing. Like, now I know that they're scared of it for sort of PR, brand reputation, and sort of compliance reasons. Okay. But I guess for me, I'm super naive. Like, that's exciting because then you can help them with that. And then it makes this like capital allocation, hiring decisions then have to be attached to that. It feels quite real versus, it might be kind of sort of good to give, $10 million to a nonprofit. So that's what's different to me, but it's all about execution, and so maybe that goes back to the dull materiality dialogue. Maybe that's where it has to go. But businesses got a lot of things they're focused on, and how do you prioritize execution? I think, that's what's kind of exciting to me is kind of more sort of tactician, I guess.
I love that. And I love the sideswipe at the, it's built into our DNA ridiculousness that you read everywhere.
Well, I think the beauty is that doesn't really fly anymore. Because you can't be like, oh, was scope 3 built into your DNA? I'm being a little churlish.
Well, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll talk again soon.